Welcome to the English with Kirsty podcast from www.englishwithkirsty.com. Here I'll be sharing with you tips, information and other learning resources so that you can improve your business English. Hello everybody and welcome to episode 10 of the English with Kirsty podcast. And this week I'm going to share something with you. It's the most popular blog post from my blog. So every month I'm surprised that this post gets more attention than many of the others. It's really interesting to see how this keeps going because it's not something I wrote in the last couple of months, but it is by far the most popular. And I thought because people want to read this post, I will also share it with you, my blog listeners. And so the post is about mistakes, but not just any mistakes. It's specific mistakes that people make if they're German speakers and they're learning English. And I know that I do have quite a lot of German speakers in my podcast listener group. So sorry if you're not a German listener, but some of these things may still apply. And there's still mistakes that nobody should be making. So have a listen anyway and you may still learn something. But for the German speakers among you, these are things that I hear quite often because I mainly work with people whose native language is German, and therefore because I speak German as well, I can understand how these mistakes are made, because often when you speak another language you're thinking in your own language sometimes, or you know how things are phrased in your own language, and sometimes that carries over into the language that you're learning, and this can cause us to make mistakes. That happens with English speakers too, of course. When they're learning other languages, we sometimes say things because they're a certain way in English, but they're not that way in the language we're learning, so we make mistakes as well. And so the whole point of this is to help people. So if you know what mistakes other people are making, you can avoid making them yourself. So there are 10 of them, and the first one is in the near of. I hear that quite a lot because it's literally translated from German. But in English it doesn't need to be that long. We can just say, I live near London, I live near the cinema, or whatever you're talking about, but you don't need to have this more complicated phrase in the near of, because we just don't have that in English. Number 2, for 3 years is perfectly legitimate. It's fine if you mean that something lasts 3 years. So for example, you can say, I have been learning English for 3 years. You started 3 years ago and you're still learning it now, so yeah, it lasts 3 years. But if you mean something that happened 3 years ago, so this podcast is being recorded in 2015, so if something happened in 2012, that's 3 years ago. That's not for 3 years, because we're talking about a point in time 3 years earlier than now, and that's 3 years ago. The for 3 years is only if something lasts 3 years. So that's the difference there. Another thing is we were 5, we were 7. In our English class we were 5. That doesn't sound so good. So there were 5 people in our English class. You could say there were 5 of us in our English class, but this we were and then adding a number, that doesn't sound good in English, so try to avoid that. And then to feel something. So if you're talking about your emotions, you feel happy, you feel sad, you feel tired, you feel angry, you feel relaxed, all of these things, you just, who's feeling the emotion? And then the part of the verb to feel. So if it's he or she or it, it's going to be feels, not feel. And then the emotion. And in the past, I felt tired, I felt miserable, whatever it is, I felt really happy. You don't add myself, himself, herself. It's not a reflexive verb, like I hurt myself or something like that. It doesn't take this myself. So you never say I feel myself happy or I feel myself angry. That's not necessary. You just take this word away, and because it's not a reflexive verb, you just have I feel happy, that kind of thing. Number 5, talking about possession. It's really easy in English. You can just add apostrophe s when you're saying that something belongs to someone. So my friend's dog, my partner's laptop. It doesn't sound so good to say the laptop of my partner is better than mine. The dog of my friend is barking. It just doesn't sound good, and it makes it longer than it needs to be. So just remember, this apostrophe S can be used when you're using names, like Kirsty's English courses. That's more similar to the German, just where you add the S. But here, if you're talking about a specific person, like my friend, my partner, my mother, you can use it there too. So my mother's handbag, my friend's office, these kind of things. You can just add the apostrophe S and then, or the S apostrophe if it's plural, but that's a whole new episode about the use of apostrophe, which I will do at some point, because there's a lot of confusion about it, not least because a lot of English people get it wrong as well. But just aside from that, you don't you don't need that here. You can just add an apostrophe S, so like my partner's laptop. Another mistake that I see a lot, number 6, is using conditionals. And again, we could do another session on conditionals. I do have a grammar module on conditionals if you want to sign up for that. But just try, one rule to remember is that the would doesn't come in the part of the sentence where the if is. So something like, if I would have enough money, is wrong, because the would comes in what would you do if you had enough money. There are 3 types of conditionals, and usually the one that's where the mistakes are made is this type 2, because in the sentence we had, the example, it's not if I would have enough money, it's if I had enough money. And then what would you do? I would buy a bigger house. I would buy a horse. I would go on a trip around the world. So this would comes in the second part of the sentence, and in the first part of the sentence you have the if, you have the person, and then you have your verb in the past tense. So if I had enough money, if I won the lottery, if I left my job. We don't need would in any of these sentences because it doesn't belong there. It belongs in the second part with what you would do. I would buy a horse, I would buy a bigger house, that kind of thing. So try to remember that the would doesn't belong in the part of the sentence where the if is. It belongs in the other part. Number 7 is all about adjectives and adverbs, because in English there are 2. It's important whether you need an adjective or an adverb. And the adjective describes a noun. She is beautiful, he is hardworking, that kind of thing. She is intelligent. And your adverb describes a verb, so how you do something. The people outside were shouting loudly. The car in front was being driven slowly. So all these things, how something is being done, that's an adverb. And although in German it's the same word for the adjective or the adverb, in English it makes a difference. So you can't say something like, she slammed the door angry, because to slam the door is a verb. And because it's a verb, we need an adverb to describe this verb. Angry is an adjective, it's describing the person. So you could say, she was angry and she slammed the door. That's fine because you're describing this lady. How did she feel? She was angry. And then what did she do? She slammed the door. But if you're going to describe how she slammed the door, you need an adverb. And here it's angrily, not angry. So often these adverbs just add ly or illy. There are some exceptions. There are always exceptions. But often the adverbs have ly at the end. So in this case, it should be she slammed the door angrily. Number 8, in the bus. I know it's not logical. It's very strange to imagine when we say on the train, on the bus, on the plane. It's usually these bigger vehicles in which you can stand up. So we do say in the car, but we don't say in the bus. It's on the bus or on the train. I don't know why, but that's just a rule that you need to remember. It doesn't mean that you're on the roof of the train. We just say, oh, I was on the train, I read the book on the train, and it means that you're essentially in the train, but we never say in the train. Number 9 I included because I heard, I received an email with things like, I think it said BR or KR, and I had no idea what it meant. It was an abbreviation for kind regards or best regards, and apparently that's become quite common practice in some companies where English is spoken, some German companies, but as native English speakers we don't do that. If we want to say kind regards, we write it out. And I know it's come from like the abbreviations for the German greetings, but it's not something that we do in England, so you may confuse your reader if you do that. So if you want to write kind regards, then you have to write it out in full. And the last one, how does it look like? I've seen that a few times. It's how does it look, or what does it look like? You can't have how does it look like. So they are the 10 mistakes. I may do another one actually. Seeing as this post has been so popular, I may find another 10 mistakes that I regularly come across and do another post. If I do, I'll probably do that as a joint blog post and podcast. Now I have the podcast, and obviously you'll find out about that. But if you want to look at these with examples and more details, I'll link it from the show notes page. So if you go to www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast/episode 10, you'll find a link to this blog entry, and it has the headings, and then there's a bit of information under each one. And similarly, if you're interested in whether you make any of these mistakes, if you want to have any one-to-one tuition, I do language and communications training. So if you're interested in that, then you can find out a bit more about that. You can get in touch. And if you listen to last week's podcast, you'll know that there's a code that gives you a £10 discount when you buy the language and communications training, or any training actually. You can use the code for any of the training products. So if you want to get that code, then you need to listen to episode 9 of the podcast. Okay, so I hope those tips were helpful. I hope they've given you some ideas about mistakes to avoid, and maybe you've seen people making these mistakes before, maybe you've made them yourself, but if you can avoid using this language and making these mistakes, it will make your English sound better and more authentic. Okay, have a great week, and see you again next week for episode 11. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the English with Kirsty podcast. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is kirsty@englishwithkirsty.com, or you can go to www.englishwithkirsty.com/podcast, where you'll find information about the individual episodes.